The golden afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Margaret's dining room, casting delicate shadows across the mahogany table she had polished that morning. At 73, her hands moved with the practiced precision of decades spent keeping house, arranging the good china plates in perfect symmetry. The aroma of her famous pot roast filled the air, mingling with the subtle scent of lavender from her garden that she'd picked fresh that morning. Margaret stepped back to admire her work, smoothing her floral apron with trembling fingers. Today was special. After months of strained phone calls and canceled visits, her son David and his wife Jessica were finally coming for dinner. She had spent the entire morning preparing David's favorite meal, the same recipe she'd used when he was a boy, racing through her kitchen with scraped knees and a gap-toothed grin. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 5 times, its deep resonance echoing through the quiet house. They would arrive soon. Margaret walked to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass as she watched the empty street. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, waved from her garden, and Margaret managed a smile, though her stomach churned with nervous energy. The house felt too large around her these days, filled with memories that seemed to whisper from every corner. David's childhood drawings still adorned the refrigerator, now yellowed with age. His high school trophies gleamed from the mantelpiece, and photograph after photograph chronicled his journey from her precious baby to the successful lawyer he'd become. But somewhere along the way, especially after he'd married Jessica 3 years ago, those visits had become shorter, conversations more stilted, and Margaret often felt like she was intruding on her own son's life. She returned to the kitchen, checking the roast one final time. The meat fell apart at the touch of her fork, perfectly tender. Green beans glistened with butter and almonds, just the way David liked them. Mashed potatoes sat fluffy and golden in her grandmother's serving bowl. Everything was perfect, just as it always had been for Sunday dinners when David was growing up. A car door slammed outside, and Margaret's heart jumped. She quickly untied her apron, smoothed her silver hair, and hurried to the front door. Through the beveled glass, she could see David's tall silhouette and Jessica's petite frame climbing the front steps. Taking a deep breath, Margaret opened the door with her warmest smile. "David, sweetheart." She reached up to embrace her son, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something new, something sharp and expensive. At 45, David still had her late husband's strong jawline, but his eyes held a weariness that hadn't been there when he was younger. "Hi, Mom." David's hug was brief, polite. "You remember Jessica." Jessica stepped forward, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Everything about her was immaculate, from her perfectly styled blonde hair to her tailored dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly Social Security check. At 32, Jessica possessed a cold beauty that reminded Margaret of porcelain dolls, beautiful but untouchable. "Mrs. Chen," Jessica said with a thin smile, extending a manicured hand instead of accepting Margaret's offered embrace. "It's Margaret, dear. We're family now." Margaret's voice carried just a hint of hurt, though she tried to hide it. "Please, come in. Dinner's almost ready." The dining room that had seemed so perfect an hour ago now felt oppressive under Jessica's critical gaze. Margaret watched as her daughter-in-law's eyes swept over the hand-embroidered tablecloth, the mismatched but well-loved china, the simple centerpiece of garden roses. Jessica's expression remained neutral, but Margaret caught the slight purse of her lips, the way her nose wrinkled almost imperceptibly. David seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, settling into his childhood chair with obvious comfort. "Something smells incredible, Mom." "Is that your pot roast?" "Of course, darling. Your favorite," Margaret beamed, hurrying to the kitchen to begin serving. She could hear Jessica's voice carrying from the dining room, though she couldn't make out the words. David's responses were quiet, almost apologetic. When Margaret returned with the serving platter, Jessica was examining one of the china plates with barely concealed disdain. "David tells me these belong to your mother-in-law," she said, not looking up. "Yes, they've been in the family for over 60 years. We used them for every special occasion." Margaret set the platter down carefully, pride evident in her voice. Jessica's response was non-committal, but her meaning was clear. "These plates, this house, this woman, were all relics of a past that had no place in her carefully curated future. As they settled around the table, Margaret felt the familiar ache of trying too hard. She passed dishes with eager hands, filled glasses before they emptied, and peppered her son with questions about his work, his health, his happiness. David answered dutifully, but his attention seemed divided, constantly glancing at Jessica, as if seeking approval for every word. The conversation flowed awkwardly, punctuated by long silences that Margaret desperately tried to fill. She told stories about David's childhood, hoping to see him smile, to recapture some of the warmth that had once filled this room. But Jessica's presence seemed to suck the joy from every memory, her polite but disinterested responses making each anecdote fall flat. As the main course wound down, Margaret excused herself to prepare dessert. In the kitchen, she carefully unmolded the apple pie she'd baked that morning, its golden crust gleaming under the overhead light. She could hear Jessica's voice more clearly now, sharp and cutting through the thin walls. "I don't understand why we have to do this every month, David. It's such a waste of time." Margaret's hands stilled on the pie server. Her son's response was too quiet to hear, but Jessica's reply rang clear and cruel. "She's suffocating, don't you see that? And this house, it's like a museum. Everything's old and shabby. Even the food tastes like something from the 1952nd. The pie server clattered against the counter as Margaret's hands began to shake. She gripped the edge of the kitchen island, trying to steady herself, as Jessica's words cut deeper. "We could be at the country club right now, having a proper meal with civilized people. Instead, we're stuck here pretending to care about her boring stories and eating off chipped plates that should have been thrown away years ago." Margaret closed her eyes, fighting back tears. This was her home, her life, her family. These weren't just chipped plates, they were memories, history, love served on heirloom china. But through Jessica's eyes, she saw herself as others might see her, a lonely old woman clinging to the past, desperately trying to hold on to a son who had outgrown her. Taking a shuddering breath, Margaret composed herself. She would not let Jessica see how deeply her words had wounded. With trembling hands, she served 3 generous slices of pie and returned to the dining room, her smile carefully fixed in place. "Apple pie with cinnamon ice cream," she announced, setting the plates down with only the slightest tremor in her voice. David's face lit up. "Mom, you didn't have to go to all this trouble." "No trouble at all, sweetheart. You know how much I love cooking for my family." Jessica picked at her pie with obvious reluctance, taking tiny bird-like bites. "It's very traditional," she said finally. And Margaret knew that in Jessica's vocabulary, traditional was synonymous with inferior. The remainder of dinner passed in stilted conversation. Margaret asked about their upcoming vacation to Europe, trying to show interest in their lives, their world that seemed so far removed from her own. Jessica dominated the conversation, describing 5-star hotels and Michelin-starred restaurants with the casual indifference of someone accustomed to luxury. As the evening wore on, Margaret began clearing the table, refusing David's offer to help with the same gentle insistence she'd used since he was a child. "You're my guests," she said warmly. "Sit and relax." But as she gathered the plates, she noticed that Jessica had barely touched her food. The pot roast sat cold and congealing on her plate, the vegetables pushed around but hardly eaten. Margaret felt a familiar stab of inadequacy. She had spent hours preparing this meal, choosing each ingredient with care, cooking with all the love in her heart, and it wasn't good enough. "Was everything all right with the dinner, dear?" Margaret asked quietly, unable to keep the hurt from her voice. Jessica looked up with surprise, as if she'd forgotten Margaret was there. "Oh, it was fine. I'm just not very hungry." "We had a late lunch." Another lie. Another small cruelty delivered with casual indifference. Margaret had called David that morning to confirm the time, specifically asking if they would be hungry for dinner. But she said nothing, just nodded, and continued clearing. Each untouched plate feeling like a personal rejection. In the kitchen, Margaret scraped Jessica's barely touched meal into the garbage, watching hours of work disappear into the trash. Her dog, A golden retriever named Bailey, who had been her constant companion since her husband's death, watched with patient eyes from his bed in the corner. At 12 years old, Bailey moved slowly but still greeted each day with the gentle enthusiasm that had made him the perfect companion for her golden years. "At least you appreciate my cooking, don't you, boy?" Margaret whispered, scratching behind his ears. Bailey's tail wagged weakly, and she slipped him a small piece of the pot roast, watching his eyes light up with simple joy. When Margaret returned to the dining room, she found Jessica checking her phone with obvious boredom, while David fidgeted uncomfortably in his chair. The sight of her son's discomfort sparked something protective in Margaret's chest. This was supposed to be a pleasant family dinner, but Jessica's presence had turned it into an endurance test for all of them. "Would you like some coffee?" Margaret offered, hoping to extend the evening, to find some way to connect with these two people, who felt increasingly like strangers in her home. "Actually, Mom, we should probably head home soon," David said apologetically. "Jessica has an early meeting tomorrow. On Sunday?" Margaret couldn't hide her surprise. Jessica looked up from her phone with mild irritation. "Some of us have demanding careers that don't stop for weekends." The barb hit its mark. Margaret had been a housewife and mother, dedicating her life to raising David and supporting her husband's modest accounting practice. She had never climbed corporate ladders or commanded boardrooms, but she had created a home filled with love and warmth. At least, she had thought so until now. "Of course," Margaret said quietly. "I understand." But as she moved to clear the remaining dishes, Jessica's phone rang with a shrill tone that seemed to echo through the quiet house. Without excusing herself, Jessica answered immediately. "Brandy?" "Oh my God, yes, hold on." Jessica stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I need to take this. It's important." She walked toward the living room, her heels clicking authoritatively, her voice already animated in a way it had never been during dinner. "You will not believe what happened at the Hendersons' party last night." Margaret and David sat in awkward silence, listening to Jessica's laughter echoing from the next room. Her animated conversation about parties and gossip stood in stark contrast to the polite disinterest she had shown throughout dinner. "She's under a lot of stress at work," David said quietly, not meeting his mother's eyes. Margaret nodded, though they both knew it wasn't stress that made Jessica treat her with such casual cruelty. It was something deeper, something that made Margaret feel like an unwelcome presence in her own son's life. "David," Margaret began carefully, "are you happy?" Her son looked up sharply, surprise flickering across his features. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you happy? Really happy?" David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the tablecloth in a nervous habit Margaret remembered from his childhood. When he finally spoke, his voice was uncertain. "I have everything I thought I wanted, Mom. The house, the practice, Jessica. Everything's going according to plan. That's not what I asked." Before David could respond, Jessica returned, sliding her phone into her purse with obvious reluctance. "Sorry about that. Crisis at work." She glanced around the dining room with barely concealed impatience. "Are we ready to go?" Margaret felt the familiar surge of disappointment that had become the hallmark of these visits. Every time she hoped things would be different, that somehow she could bridge the growing gap between herself and her son. But Jessica's presence made every interaction feel artificial, every conversation stilted. "Let me pack you some leftovers," Margaret offered, desperate to extend even this unsatisfying connection. "That's not necessary," Jessica said quickly. "We're trying to eat healthier." The words hung in the air like a slap. Margaret had spent decades perfecting these recipes, meals that had nourished her family with love as much as food. To hear them dismissed as unhealthy, unworthy, felt like a rejection of everything she had given her life to creating. David shot his wife a sharp look. "Mom, that would be great. You know I love your leftovers." But the damage was done. Margaret could see it in the way David's shoulders sagged, in the tight line of Jessica's mouth, in the way the very air in the room seemed to vibrate with tension. She nodded and retreated to the kitchen, mechanically packing containers she wasn't sure would be welcomed. As she worked, Margaret could hear them talking in low voices, the occasional sharp whisper that suggested an argument. She tried not to listen, but in her own home, there was nowhere to go to escape the sound of her son defending her in hushed, apologetic tones, while his wife made her displeasure known. When she returned with a carefully packed bag of leftovers, she found them standing by the front door, Jessica's body language screaming her desire to leave. David accepted the bag with genuine gratitude, and for a moment, Margaret glimpsed the little boy who used to help her in the kitchen, sneaking tastes and asking for seconds. "Thank you for dinner, Mom." It was wonderful, as always. Jessica remained silent, checking her watch with theatrical obviousness. The goodbye felt hurried, incomplete. David's hug was warmer than his greeting had been, and Margaret found herself clinging to it for just a moment too long, trying to memorize the feeling of her son in her arms. When she finally let go, she saw something like regret flicker across his features. "I'll call you this week," he promised, though they both knew the calls had become increasingly infrequent, increasingly brief. "Drive safely," Margaret said, forcing brightness into her voice. "And David? Bring Jessica back any time, she's always welcome here." The lie came easily, a mother's attempt to keep peace in her child's marriage, even at the cost of her own dignity. Jessica's smile was as thin and sharp as a blade. "Of course. Thanks for everything." Margaret stood in the doorway, watching their expensive car disappear into the gathering dusk. The street was quiet except for the distant sound of children playing in someone's backyard, their laughter a stark contrast to the hollow feeling expanding in her chest. Bailey appeared at her side, his warm presence a comfort against her leg. She reached down to scratch his ears, grateful for the unconditional love that asked for nothing more than her presence. "Well, boy, I suppose it's just us again." The house felt different as she returned to the dining room, the silence no longer companionable but oppressive. The remnants of dinner sat scattered across the table. Used napkins, empty glasses, the detritus of a meal that had brought no joy. Margaret began clearing mechanically, her movements automatic after years of practice. But as she lifted Jessica's plate, barely touched, and still full of food she had prepared with such hope, something inside Margaret snapped. The careful composure she had maintained throughout the evening crumbled, and she sank into her chair, the plate still clutched in her hands. The tears came suddenly, silently, streaming down her cheeks as she stared at the untouched pot roast. This wasn't just about food, she knew. This was about respect, about love, about the gradual erosion of her place in her son's life. Jessica hadn't just rejected her cooking, she had rejected everything Margaret was, everything she represented. Bailey seemed to sense her distress, padding over to rest his graying muzzle on her knee. His brown eyes were full of the simple understanding that only dogs possessed, and Margaret found herself talking to him as she had so many times since her husband's death. "I don't know what I did wrong, Bailey. I tried so hard to make her feel welcome, to show her that she's part of our family now. But she looks at me like I'm something embarrassing, something to be endured." She set the plate down and buried her face in her hands, letting the hurt flow freely. In her own home, with only Bailey as witness, she could finally acknowledge the pain that Jessica's casual cruelty had inflicted. Each dismissive glance, each polite but cold response, each uneaten meal had built into a wall between Margaret and the family she had devoted her life to creating. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, its deep notes echoing through the house. Margaret wiped her eyes and looked down at Bailey, who was watching the untouched plate with the patient hope that all dogs showed around food. "You know what, boy?" Jessica said she wasn't hungry, that the food wasn't good enough for her. Margaret's voice grew stronger, edged with something that hadn't been there during dinner. "But you appreciate good cooking, don't you?" Bailey's tail wagged at the word cooking, and Margaret found herself smiling for the first time all evening. She picked up the plate, looking at the perfectly prepared pot roast that Jessica had dismissed with such disdain. "If she thinks this food isn't worthy of her refined palate, then I know someone who will appreciate it properly." Margaret carried Jessica's plate to the kitchen, Bailey following hopefully behind her. She looked down at the golden retriever, his patient brown eyes fixed on her with the kind of pure, uncomplicated love that she had been missing from her human interactions. "You know what, Bailey? You've always appreciated my cooking. You've never once complained that it wasn't good enough, that it was too traditional or unhealthy. She knelt down beside his food bowl, her decision crystallizing with each word. "And you deserve a proper meal more than someone who can't even show basic courtesy in a guest's home." With deliberate movements, Margaret scraped Jessica's untouched dinner into Bailey's bowl. The pot roast, vegetables, and mashed potatoes, hours of careful preparation that had been deemed unworthy, now sat before a creature who would receive it with genuine gratitude. Bailey's tail wagged furiously as he recognized the unexpected feast before him. "There you go, sweet boy. Someone should enjoy this meal the way it was meant to be enjoyed." As Bailey ate with the enthusiasm that only a dog could show for a home-cooked meal, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time all evening, she felt a sense of rightness, of justice served in the simplest way possible. Her cooking would be appreciated, even if not by the people she had hoped would love it. She sat on the kitchen floor beside Bailey, watching him savor every bite with the kind of pure enjoyment that Jessica had been incapable of showing. His tail never stopped wagging, and between bites, he would look up at her with eyes that seemed to say thank you, more eloquently than any words Jessica had spoken all evening. "You know what the funny thing is, Bailey?" Margaret said, scratching behind his ears as he ate. "She thinks she's too good for this food, for this house, for me. But she doesn't understand what she's missing. She doesn't understand that love is the most important ingredient in any recipe." The kitchen felt warmer now, filled with the simple contentment of a dog enjoying his meal, and a woman finally standing up for herself in the only way she knew how. Margaret had spent her entire adult life trying to please others, to make everyone comfortable and happy, often at the expense of her own dignity. But tonight, watching Jessica's rejected meal being received with such joy, she felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years: defiance. Bailey finished the last bite and looked up at her with complete satisfaction, his pink tongue lolling out in a doggy grin. Margaret laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine warmth. "That's right, boy. That's how you properly appreciate good food and the person who made it for you." She stood and began washing the dishes with renewed energy, her movements more purposeful than they had been all evening. Each plate she cleaned, each glass she dried, felt like an act of reclaiming her space, her worth, her dignity. This was her home, filled with her memories and her love, and no amount of designer clothes or condescending smiles could diminish that. As she worked, Margaret found herself thinking about her late husband, Robert. He had always appreciated her cooking, always made her feel like the most important person in his world. He would have been appalled by Jessica's behavior tonight, would have quietly but firmly put her in her place with the kind of gentle strength that had made him such a wonderful partner and father. "What would you have done tonight, Robert?" she whispered to the empty kitchen. "How would you have handled that woman's disrespect?" The answer came to her clearly, in her husband's warm voice that she still heard sometimes in quiet moments. "You did exactly right, Maggie. You showed more class in feeding the dog her dinner than she showed in refusing to eat it." The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through Margaret's bedroom windows. She woke with a lightness in her chest that had been absent for months, the weight of yesterday's dinner somehow transformed into something approaching triumph. Bailey stretched and yawned from his bed beside her, his tail beginning its morning rhythm of pure happiness at seeing her face. "Good morning, you grateful boy," Margaret said, reaching down to stroke his soft fur. "Did you sleep well after your gourmet dinner?" Bailey's response was a full-body wag that spoke volumes about his satisfaction with the previous evening's unexpected feast. Margaret laughed, the sound echoing through the quiet house with more joy than it had contained in months. As she made her way to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, Margaret passed the dining room where last night's drama had unfolded. But instead of the shame and hurt she expected to feel, she experienced something closer to pride. She had finally, in her own quiet way, stood up for herself. Jessica had dismissed her cooking, her home, her very worth with casual cruelty, but Margaret had found a way to ensure that the love she poured into her food was properly received and appreciated. The phone rang as she was preparing Bailey's regular breakfast, causing both of them to startle. Margaret glanced at the clock. 8:30 a.m. Unusually early for a social call. Her heart jumped slightly when she saw David's name on the caller ID. "Hello, sweetheart," she answered, working to keep her voice normal. "Mom?" David's voice sounded strained, uncertain. We need to talk. Margaret's stomach tightened. Of course, dear. Is everything all right? There was a long pause before David continued. Jessica told me what happened last night. About the dog getting her dinner. The words hung in the air between them, and Margaret felt her newfound confidence waver slightly. She had known this moment would come, had known that Jessica would twist the story to make herself the victim, but she had hoped for more time to prepare, to find the right words to explain herself. I see, Margaret said carefully. And what exactly did Jessica tell you? She said you deliberately fed her meal to Bailey after she politely declined to finish it. She's pretty upset, Mom. She feels like it was meant as some kind of insult. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of trying to navigate the treacherous waters of her daughter-in-law's sensibilities. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't willing to immediately apologize for standing up for herself. David, can I ask you something? Sure, Mom. Did you enjoy dinner last night? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Yes, of course I did. You know I love your cooking. And did Jessica enjoy it? Another pause, longer this time. Margaret could almost hear David's discomfort through the phone as he struggled with the truth. She said she wasn't very hungry. She barely touched her food, David. She spent the entire evening making it clear that nothing about my home, my cooking, or my company met her standards. She took a phone call in the middle of dinner and spoke to her friend with more warmth and enthusiasm than she showed me all evening. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by months of swallowed hurt and silent endurance. So yes, I gave her untouched meal to Bailey. Because Bailey appreciates good food and the love that goes into making it. Because Bailey has never once made me feel small or unwelcome in my own home. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that Margaret wondered if the call had been disconnected. When David finally spoke, his voice was quiet, thoughtful. Mom, I know Jessica can be difficult sometimes. Difficult? The word escaped before Margaret could stop it, loaded with all the pain and frustration she had been carrying. David, she treats me like an embarrassing relic that she has to endure. She dismisses everything I am, everything I've worked to create in this home, and you sit there and let her do it because you're afraid of upsetting her. The truth hung between them, raw and undeniable. Margaret heard her son's sharp intake of breath and knew her words had found their mark. I don't. David struggled with his response, and Margaret could picture him running his hand through his hair the way he had since childhood when faced with difficult emotions. Sweetheart, I love you more than my own life. You know that. But I won't continue to pretend that Jessica's behavior is acceptable just to keep the peace. I deserve better than that, and frankly, so do you.